Well met, travelers. I just got back from watching James Gunn's Superman, and to say that I loved this movie would be an understatement. I was transported by this movie, transported out of my daily life, out of my very sense of self, out of it felt this reality altogether. It wasn't any specific moment in or element of the film that transported me, but really just the whole vibe of the thing. For the first time, I witnessed the Superman reality I've always wanted to see on the big screen. That perfect balance of moral earnestness and campy absurdity that has defined the last son of Krypton in comics for almost a century now. My experience with this movie was sublime. It was mystical, mythic, even a bit transcendent. In a word, it was religious. So, this video is not going to be a review of James Gunn's Superman. Instead, it's going to be a brief meditation on virtue, on the liminality of storytelling, and on the nature of, well, of the gods, whatever those are. And like any good essay on Superman, I am going to open it with a quote from Carl Sagan. In some respects, science has far surpassed religion in delivering awe. How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. Instead, they say, no, no, no. My God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way. A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by contemporary science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. Shortly after the final frame of Superman rolled, I realized that I had not actually been in the room for most of the movie. What I mean by that is that while my body was physically present in the theater, my identity as a self had vanished for most of the film. Somewhere around the turn of the first act, I had simply dissolved into the world of the story, my I-ness completely replaced by pure awareness. By that state of undifferentiated consciousness that's normally associated with states of deep meditation, contemplative prayer, or psychedelic journeys. And in this liminal state, I experienced the characters, especially Superman himself, as beings, not just characters. And I left that theater with a renewed commitment to virtues I have tried to uphold my whole life. Virtues like courage, kindness, honesty, honor, and justice. A commitment that felt like it had been downloaded into me from some other reality, imparted to me by a Superman who was more than just an actor on a screen, by a Superman who was, in some sense, real.
What is real? How do you define real?
Now, I've experienced this state of being before, call it a flow state, because I do practice things that can induce it, which is how I recognized what had happened. And like I said, I don't think it was any specific thing about the movie that induced it this time. The film itself was only one part of a random concatenation of events that converged at just the right time. A concatenation, call it a brush with fate, that I have chosen to explore rather than question. And the most salient thing I took away from my viewing experience was the overwhelming, humbling sense that I had encountered Superman, not simply enjoyed a movie about Superman. For that brief period in the darkened theater, Superman, and to a lesser extent the other characters as well, felt absolutely real to me, like a real person, and also like something more than, something bigger than a mere person, something, I dare say, like a god. Now, Superman is not a god by any definition, not even the half-baked materialist one I'm about to lay on you here. By my lights, he is more akin to the culture heroes of yore, like the Anglo-Saxon Beowulf, the Greek Achilles, or the Irish Cuchulainn. But what are gods, really, if not at least culture heroes writ larger, personified to embody aspects of reality that strike us mere mortals as both ominous and wise, as forces to be both feared and learned from? I couldn't help thinking, as I left the theater, that sense of encountering Superman rather than merely watching him must have been how it felt to meet a god by the fire in ancient times, before the written word, before electricity, before storytelling and performance had been almost entirely compartmentalized away from their original context in spiritual practice and ritual. Don't get me wrong here. I am not about to issue some dumb fascist call to return to tradition or anything like that. No, I'm just pointing at a deep evolutionary heritage that explains why we love the movies. Sitting in a darkened room, watching actors bring characters to life through the mediums of light and shadow is an experience that taps into a heritage older than civilization itself. So it's no wonder that sometimes going to the movies can spark what, for lack of a better word, could be called a religious experience. We could use other words: transcendent, spiritual, mystical, numinous, immersive. Language fails us here, which is why so much of this non-rational side of human consciousness, as opposed to irrational, is expressed and passed down through art and literature rather than science. And in the modern world, that includes comics and movies and television and video games. These are mediums that can convey truth and explore truth that isn't necessarily factual. For the record, I do not believe in the existence of personal gods. My spirituality is grounded in religious naturalism, which posits that the current scientific understanding of the material universe is more than sufficient to inspire the awe and reverence that motivates religious worship. I supplement my own practice with trappings of animism, panpsychism, Celtic paganism, and death of God Christianity informed by liberation theology. In other words, spiritual orientations that locate divinity, if there is such a thing, entirely within what we call the material world, whose ethical focus is on life in the here and now, with a long view that imposes upon us obligations to future generations and other species. There is no realm other than this one that matters to us spiritually or ethically. There are no mighty beings who exist in some other dimension, waiting to judge us when we die. There is no afterlife, apart from the reputation and legacy we leave to linger in the minds of those we leave behind. But there are plenty of mighty concepts and natural forces in the here and now that reliably provoke religious feelings like awe, wonder, dread, devotion, grief, or universal love. Beautiful, terrible concepts and forces that remind us how small and insignificant we are, yet also challenge us to distinguish ourselves and become better than we were. So, while I do not believe in personal gods, I am open to the existence of personified gods. Personified gods are the ones we invent to give name to those vast concepts and forces. They do not and cannot exist independent of collective human consciousness and culture. Yet at the same time, they can and do persist independent of any individual human mind. The pagan philosopher Brendan Myers has named this collection of concepts and forces the immensities. An immensity is any overwhelming encounter that provokes an existential response in mere mortals. As he writes in his book, The Other Side of Virtue, quote, "The immensity is an experience of something which appears to surpass the reach of human power. Because they appear powerful, we become aware of our weaknesses. Because they appear eternal, we find our own transience. Rudolf Otto wrote in The Idea of the Holy that the most singular property of the spiritual experience is that it shakes us, overwhelms us, makes us feel small, and leaves us changed. This is the greatness of the immensity. The mountain is older and larger than we are, and so it appears greater than we are. We say that a mountain soars, towers, ascends above us. This is not a fact about the mountain. The mountain itself does not actually move anywhere. It is simply there, And yet it is not really wrong to speak of the mountain that way. The reason here is essentially phenomenological. For the mountain's shape draws our attention upward. It makes us look up. We literally tilt our heads upwards, and we experience a conscious or unconscious projection of what it would be like to be up there. Thus, it is the imagination that moves, and then projects the motion of the mountain. With that projection comes certain expectations, such as an expectation of what effort it would take to climb the mountain, or what the world might look like from up there. This expectation is part of our experience of looking at it. We also become aware of how dangerous and risky it would be to try. We become aware of the possibility of failure. To experience the immensity is to anticipate difficulty, frustration, resistance, and challenge. But it is also to anticipate the joy of success, the amazement of further new discoveries, the pride in one's own accomplishments, and indeed, the ability to rest." Unquote. Myers identifies three essential qualities of an immensity: time, greatness, and authority. Quote, "They distinguish the true spiritual experience from the imaginative fancy. The immensity is the sort of experience that changes one's relationship to time, goes beyond one's own skills, abilities, and powers, and demands a certain response. At least one of these elements, usually the third, is always present in the experience of an immensity. Because of its ability to make a claim upon you, because of its ability to require a response, the immensity is a source of value and meaning from beyond the individual self. The immensity, presenting itself to you from beyond the horizon of the familiar, necessarily presents a value that is not of one's own creation." Unquote. Thus, the raw facts of any given immensity need not be anything non-material. The mountain is, after all, simply there. But because human brains experience immensities as something that surpasses us, requiring us to respond, we tend to personify them as gods. And we can derive ethical value and purpose from responding to that experience, following that call, and even engaging with that personification through ritual practices. We can become better, more vital, more mentally and physically healthy people, even if there is actually nothing there but the mountain. The Norse god Thor is not simply a god of lightning. He is the personification of how lightning storms made our ancestors feel and what they thought they should do with themselves in response. Jesus is not simply the son of Adonai. He's the personification of some ancestors' experience of universal radical love and demands that we radically alter our life in response. Aphrodite is not merely a goddess of fertility. She is the personification of how erotic love can overwhelm us and calls us to build future generations. And what's more, these gods take on an independent existence of their own through the intersubjective realm of representation in art and literature, absorbed and imprinted into human brains through neural pathways that engage with the rich cultural and spiritual associations that art and literature reinforce. Thus, though they were human inventions, they are also, in some sense, independently real. In his book, Myers identifies multiple sources of immensity, chiefly nature, death, and other people. These are broad categories by his own admission, but even still, they do not cover every possible experience or source of the existential challenge an immensity can present. For fictional characters can also be immensities, especially ones that have cultural footprints that span generations. Take Superman, for example. Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joel Shuster in 1938, but he quickly became much larger than his creators. Superman persists across generations and cultures, both preserved in and evolving through art, literature, film, television, and video games. He personifies larger-than-life concepts like truth, justice, the American way, and/or a better tomorrow. An encounter with Superman can call an individual human to something like devotion, or inspire normative changes in their ethical behavior. And such an encounter indelibly imprints itself into the neural pathways of said individual, granting itself something of a material existence that lingers in the person's brain and gets reinforced by the multi-generational cultural transmission that inspired it to begin with. Superman has become, in some sense, real. I experienced him as an immensity when I watched James Gunn's movie and walked out of it committed to being a better man. My encounter confronted me with my own shortcomings and demanded a moral response. And this is precisely how many of the characters within the movie experience Superman as well. Superman himself, within his own mind and lived experience, is just a guy with fears and flaws and failures like the rest of us. But to many of the supporting characters around him, and certainly to much of the population of the wider world who have never met him personally, Superman is an immensity, a great and powerful force whose mere existence presents an existential challenge to their moral identities and demands a response. Some of them don't handle that so well, but many of them make the right choice because they know that's what Superman would want them to do. So does this mean that Superman is in fact a god, despite what I said before? Personally, I don't think so. But he is well on his way. Give him another 100 years and get back to me. The reason Superman doesn't count as a god, even by the definition I described here, is that he doesn't have any worshippers. At least that I know of. I'm sure the internet will surprise me in the comments section if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, there is no multi-generational tradition of conducting rituals to Superman. For all his great cultural power, the Man of Steel has not yet broken the barrier of theology. He is not a god, but he is a culture hero, and that makes him a myth. And that is a good start. Superman does have something in common with the gods I described here, though. Like them, he does not and cannot exist independent of collective human consciousness. Though he can inspire greatness in humans and has developed a cultural persistence independent of any individual human mind, he will never be real enough to save the world. That task falls to us, as it always has. We are, all of us today, confronted by immensities unique to our here and now. The global climate is in crisis. Fascism is on the rise across the world, and they demand an existential moral response. So we all have a choice before us. Capitulate to the madness, or rise to the occasion. Inspired, if need be, by other immensities like Superman, who cannot really come to save us, but just might, if we let him, enable us to save ourselves. Thanks for watching, and go with blessings into the fight for truth, justice, and a better tomorrow. I'm a punk rocker, yes I am. Well, I'm a punk rocker, yes I am.